You won't believe what happened. Marcus, a black employee, endured humiliation from his racist boss for a long time. But that day, patience ran out, and something happened that shocked everyone. The boss hit him first, but Marcus fought back. The fight in the office has become a real battle for justice. Don't miss it. It will be hot until the very end. What happened next? Subscribe to the channel, like it, and write in the comments what you think about this situation. Marquis had always believed that hard work would pave the way to success, but his experience at Alton Enterprises proved otherwise. Despite his years of dedication, it became clear that no matter how much effort he put into his job, it would never be enough in the eyes of his colleagues. From the day he started working in the company, Marquis had felt the subtle tension in the air, but over time that tension transformed into something more sinister, something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the hushed whispers when he passed by, or the way his coworkers avoided eye contact. It was the way his ideas were routinely dismissed in meetings, only to be brought up later by a white colleague and praised as innovative. It was the way the harder he worked, the more his successes were undermined while others were rewarded for doing far less. The worst of it, though, came from his boss, Mr. Graham. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a smirk that could cut through steel, Graham had always found ways to make Marquis feel inferior. The racial undertones in Graham's comments were hard to miss. "You people" was a phrase Marquis had heard more than once from his boss, often followed by some dismissive remark about his work ethic or ability to fit in with the company culture. At first, Marquis tried to brush it off. He convinced himself that if he worked harder, if he proved his worth, they would have no choice but to respect him. But no amount of long hours or flawless presentations seemed to change their perception. It wasn't long before he realized it wasn't about his work. It was about who he was. The atmosphere at Alton Enterprises became suffocating. Every day, Marquis walked into the office knowing he would face another round of subtle insults, discrediting remarks, and condescending smiles. His colleagues, all white, seemed to find joy in making his life just a bit harder. They would accidentally leave him out of important meetings, fail to pass along critical emails, and make jokes behind his back that always seemed to teeter on the edge of racial slurs. But Graham was different. He didn't hide his contempt. It wasn't just the microaggressions, it was outright hostility. Graham made it clear that no matter what Marquis did, he would never rise in the company. There were no direct threats, just enough undermining and passive-aggressive comments to wear Marquis down. One day, things reached a boiling point. Marquis had been working on a major project for weeks, pulling late nights and early mornings to ensure everything was perfect. The project was crucial not only for the company but for his own career. This was his chance to show everyone what he was capable of, to finally earn the recognition he deserved. As Marquis walked into the conference room that morning, clutching his meticulously prepared presentation, he noticed that Graham was already seated at the head of the table. His smug grin made Marquis' stomach turn, but he kept his composure. This was too important to let Graham's arrogance throw him off. The meeting began, and Marquis dove into his presentation. He laid out his ideas with clarity and precision, walking the team through every detail of the project step by step. His heart raced as he spoke, but he kept his voice steady, confident that his work would speak for itself. But then came the questions. Pointed, undermining questions. "Are you sure that's the best approach?" Graham asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, do you really think this is something you can handle?" Marquis swallowed hard, his frustration building. He knew what Graham was doing, but he tried to stay calm. "Yes, Mr. Graham, I've thoroughly researched this. It's the most efficient solution." Graham leaned back in his chair, glancing around the room as if seeking validation from the others. "Well," he said, "it sounds a bit ambitious, don't you think? Maybe it's better if we let someone else take the lead on this, someone with a little more experience." The words stung like a slap to the face. Marquis felt the blood rush to his cheeks as his colleagues nodded in agreement, their eyes avoiding his. It was clear that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much effort he put in, they had already made up their minds about him. His work, his dedication, None of it mattered because, to them, he didn't belong. As the meeting ended, Marquis gathered his papers in silence, his hands trembling with barely contained anger. Graham's smirk lingered in the corner of his eye as the room emptied, and Marquis felt the weight of humiliation settle deep in his chest. But that day, something changed. Marquis had been patient for too long. He had swallowed too many insults, turned the other cheek too many times. The injustice of it all was suffocating, and he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't sit by and let them destroy his career, his dignity, without fighting back. That evening, Marquis went home and drafted a formal complaint. He outlined every instance of discrimination he had faced, every slight, every undermining comment, and filed it with HR the next morning. It was a calculated risk. He knew it could backfire, but he couldn't remain silent any longer. For a few days, it seemed like nothing had changed. The office atmosphere was just as toxic as ever, but Marquis held on to the hope that HR would take his complaint seriously. However, his hope was quickly dashed. The following Monday, Graham called Marquis into his office. The look on his boss's face was one of thinly veiled satisfaction. "We've reviewed your complaint," Graham said, his tone condescending. "And I'm afraid we don't find any merit in your claims. In fact, we've been receiving complaints about your behavior as well. It seems you're the one causing a disruption in the team." Marquis felt the ground shift beneath him. "What are you talking about? I've done nothing but work hard." Graham cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Your attitude has been noted, Marquis. Maybe it's time you reconsider whether this is the right place for you." The words hung in the air, and Marquis realized what was happening. They weren't just dismissing his complaint, they were turning the tables on him. They were preparing to push him out. But Marquis wasn't going to leave quietly. As he stood in front of Graham's desk, something inside him hardened. He had tried to do things the right way, to follow the rules, but the system was rigged against him from the start. Now, they were forcing his hand, and Marquis knew that the real battle was just beginning. The days following the meeting with Graham were some of the hardest Marquis had ever faced. The air in the office had grown colder, more hostile. His colleagues, who had once been content to simply ignore him, now openly snickered behind his back. Whispered conversations grew louder as he walked past, filled with cruel jokes and racist undertones. It was as if his complaint had marked him as a target, and they wanted to make sure he knew his place. But despite the relentless humiliation, Marquis refused to let them break him. He arrived at the office every day, head held high, even though inside he was seething with anger. He kept pushing forward, hoping that somehow things would turn around, but deep down, he knew the situation was spiraling out of control. The final straw came one afternoon, just after lunch. Marquis had been working on a report in his small, cramped cubicle when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Graham. The scent of his cologne and the heavy clack of his shoes on the tile floor were unmistakable. "Marquis!" Graham's voice was like sandpaper, rough and grating. "We need to talk." Marquis stiffened in his seat but didn't look up from his computer. "I'm busy," he said, keeping his voice even. "I don't think you understand," Graham replied, his tone more forceful. "I said we need to talk, now." Reluctantly, Marcus stood up, his hands clenched into fists by his sides as he followed Graham out of the cubicle. They walked in silence down the hallway, past the rows of cubicles where his colleagues barely hid their smirks. Marquis could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for whatever humiliation Graham had in store. They entered Graham's office, and the door closed behind them with a soft click. Marquis stood there, his posture tense, as Graham took his seat behind the large mahogany desk. The room was filled with the scent of expensive leather and polished wood, a stark contrast to the tension that crackled in the air. "Sit," Graham ordered, gesturing to the chair across from him. Marquis didn't move. "I'll stand." Graham shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "Suit yourself." He paused, folding his hands together on the desk. "I wanted to talk to you about your performance, or, rather, the lack thereof." Marquis felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What are you talking about? I've been doing my job." "Your job?" Graham interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "You've been nothing but a disruption to this team. Complaining about every little thing, stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but it's not going to work." Marquis stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. "You know exactly what's been going on. You've been undermining me since the day I got here, and now you're trying to make it look like I'm the problem." Graham's smirk widened. "You really think anyone's going to believe that? A man like you, trying to play the victim card? It's pathetic." The words hit Marquis like a punch to the gut, and he had to bite down on his tongue to stop himself from lashing out. But the anger was building, bubbling just beneath the surface. He could feel the weight of every insult, every humiliation, pressing down on him. "I've been more than patient," Marquis said through gritted teeth. "But I'm done letting you treat me like this." Graham stood up, his eyes flashing with anger. "Treat you like what, Marquis? Like the worthless employee you are? Face it, you don't belong here. You never did." That was it. Something inside Marquis snapped. All the frustration, all the anger he had been holding back for months came rushing to the surface. He took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can keep talking to me like that?" he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you can just get away with this?" Graham's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Marquis saw a flicker of fear in his expression. But it was quickly replaced by arrogance as Graham leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "I can do whatever I want, Marcus, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Marquis didn't think. His body moved on its own, fueled by months of pent-up frustration and anger. He swung his fist, aiming for Graham's smug face, but Graham was faster. The next thing Marcus knew, a sharp pain shot through his ribs as Graham's fist connected with his side. He staggered back, clutching his side in pain, but Graham didn't stop. The older man lunged forward, landing another punch to Marquis' stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Marquis doubled over, gasping for air, his vision swimming from the pain. He had never expected Graham to hit him first. The shock of it, combined with the physical pain, left him momentarily stunned. "Look at you," Graham sneered, grabbing Marquis by the collar and yanking him upright. "You think you can come in here and challenge me? You're nothing." Marquis gritted his teeth, fighting back the tears of pain and frustration that threatened to spill over. He was stronger than this, he had to be. But the blows kept coming, and each one felt like a reminder of everything he had been fighting against, everything he had endured just to be here. Graham landed another punch, this time across Marquis' jaw, sending him stumbling back against the wall. "You should have known better," Graham hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You should have known your place." But something inside Marquis shifted. The pain, the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it all, it ignited a fire within him. He couldn't let this man win. He couldn't let Graham continue to treat him like he was nothing. As Graham moved in for another hit, Marquis blocked it, catching his wrist mid-swing. For a moment they were locked in place, both breathing heavily, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a surge of strength Marquis didn't know he had, he twisted Graham's arm, forcing the older man to stumble. Before Graham could recover, Marquis struck. His fist connected with Graham's jaw, sending him reeling backward. The momentum shifted, and Marquis could feel the power returning to him with every punch. He had been beaten down for too long, but now he was fighting back. Graham tried to retaliate, but it was too late. Marquis' blows were swift, precise, fueled by months of frustration and anger. He didn't stop until Graham was on the ground, clutching his bruised face, gasping for air. Marquis stood over him, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins, and for the first time in a long time, he felt in control. Graham's smug arrogance was gone, replaced by fear and pain. "You don't get to treat me like that anymore," Marquis said, his voice steady. "You don't get to treat anyone like that." Graham didn't respond. He just lay there, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with disbelief. Marquis took a step back, his heart still pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. He had just crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But for now, he had won. For the first time, he had stood up for himself, and it felt like a victory. The aftermath of the fight was immediate. Marquis stood over his fallen boss, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. His fists were still clenched, and his chest heaved from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Graham, sprawled out on the floor, groaned in pain, clutching his bruised face and jaw, clearly shocked by the turn of events. For a moment, the office was eerily quiet, with only the sound of heavy breathing filling the space. Marquis knew what had just happened would change everything. He had crossed a line, but so had Graham, except Graham had crossed it long ago, when he had first started using his position to belittle and torment him. Marquis had simply reached his breaking point, and now he had fought back. But there was no time for satisfaction or relief. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had assaulted his boss. In any other circumstances, that would be career suicide. But these weren't just any circumstances, and this wasn't just any boss. This was a man who had pushed him, provoked him, and unleashed a storm of racial hatred upon him day after day. Still, Marquis knew the company wouldn't see it that way. To them, he would be the aggressor, the troublemaker. The odds were already stacked against him, and this fight would only add fuel to the fire. Graham stirred, trying to push himself off the floor, but his movements were sluggish and weak. His face was contorted in pain and anger, and his eyes were filled with venom. You're finished, he croaked, spitting out a little blood as he spoke. You're done in this company. You hear me? Done. Marquis didn't respond. He stood frozen, breathing heavily, the weight of his actions sinking in. He knew he had to leave. Now. There was no point in staying here any longer, waiting for the inevitable fallout. He had to protect himself, prepare for what was to come. Without saying another word, Marquis turned on his heel and walked out of Graham's office. He could feel the eyes of his coworkers on him as he passed by the cubicles, their whispers louder now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He didn't care. Let them talk, let them judge. This was his fight, and they had no idea what he had been through. As he made his way to the elevator, his mind raced. What would happen next? Would the police be called? Would HR get involved immediately? He needed to get ahead of this situation before it spiraled out of control. The fear of what was coming gnawed at him, but deep down he knew that this fight had been inevitable. Graham had pushed him too far, and now it was time to face the consequences. The elevator doors opened, and Marquis stepped inside, his thoughts still spinning. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. There was only one person he could call right now, his friend, Michael, who worked as a lawyer specializing in workplace disputes. If anyone could help him navigate this mess, it was Michael. The elevator descended, and by the time Marquis reached the lobby, he had already dialed Michael's number. The phone rang twice before Michael's voice came through on the other end. "Marquis, what's up, man?" "I'm in trouble," Marquis said, his voice low and urgent. "Big trouble. I just got into a fight with my boss." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Wait, what? A fight? Like physical?" "Yeah," Marquis replied, rubbing his temple. "He pushed me too far. I tried to keep my cool, but he hit me first, and then I fought back." Michael let out a slow breath. "Damn, that's rough. Where are you now?" "I'm leaving the building," Marquis said. "But I don't know what to do. I'm sure he's going to call the cops or try to spin this like I attacked him out of nowhere. I need your help, man." "Okay. Listen," Michael said, his voice firm and calm. "First things first, get home. Don't talk to anyone at the company until we figure this out. I'll meet you at your place in an hour, and we'll go over everything. You need to get ahead of this before they do." "Thanks," Marquis muttered, grateful for Michael's support. "I'll see you soon." He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket just as he stepped outside the building. The fresh air hit him like a wave, but it didn't ease the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The streets buzzed with the usual city chaos, people rushing to and fro, cars honking in the distance, but Marquis felt disconnected from it all, as if he were moving in slow motion while the world sped past him. He flagged down a cab, giving the driver his address in a voice that barely registered as his own. As the cab weaved through the city streets, Marquis stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the last hour over and over again. He had done what he had to do, but now he was paying the price. How would this end? Could he salvage his career? Would anyone believe him when he said Graham started the fight? When he finally reached his apartment, Marquis paid the driver and headed inside. The quiet of his apartment was a sharp contrast to the noise and chaos of the day, but it did little to calm his nerves. He sat down on the edge of his couch, running his hands over his face, trying to make sense of everything. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Marquis opened it to find Michael standing there, dressed in a sharp suit, his briefcase in hand. "Let's talk," Michael said, stepping inside. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Marquis recounted everything that had happened. Graham's insults, the racial slurs, the relentless bullying, and finally, the fight. Michael listened carefully, taking notes as Marquis spoke, his expression serious. When Marquis finished, Michael leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the notebook. "Okay," Michael said. "It's not good, but it's not hopeless either. The fact that Graham hit you first is huge. If you can prove that, it changes everything." "But how can I prove it?" Marquis asked, the frustration evident in his voice. "It's his word against mine." Michael smiled slightly. "You'd be surprised. There are security cameras all over that building, right?" Marquis blinked, the realization hitting him like a lightning bolt. The cameras? Of course. There had to be footage of the fight, footage that would show Graham throwing the first punch. "Do you think we can get access to the footage?" Marquis asked, his hope returning. "We'll have to move fast," Michael said, nodding. "But I know a guy who can help us with that. If there's footage, we'll get it. And once we have that, Graham's whole story falls apart." Marquis leaned back in his chair, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time he felt like he had a chance. Graham might have the company on his side, but Marquis had the truth, and with Michael's help, he was going to prove it. But they both knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The next few days felt like a blur for Marquis. He stayed out of the office, following Michael's advice to avoid any direct contact with the company until they had more information. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about everything Graham had done to him leading up to that moment. The insults, the racism, the constant undermining. This was the moment where Marquis would stand up and show that he wasn't just going to let them bury the truth. Michael had gotten in touch with his contact, a man named Jake who specialized in corporate security and had a way of accessing building footage quickly. If there was a recording of the fight, Jake was the one who could find it. Marquis knew everything hinged on that video. It wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about exposing the rot inside the company. As he sat in his apartment, anxiously awaiting any news, Marquis's mind raced through the possibilities. Would the video be enough? Would it show everything, or had Graham somehow already gotten to it and erased the evidence? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but Marquis held on to the hope that the truth would come out. On the fourth day, Michael called. "We've got it," he said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "The footage. Jake sent it to me this morning. I'm on my way to your place now." Marquis's heart raced as he hung up the phone. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. When Michael arrived, he wasted no time. He sat down at Marquis's table, pulled out his laptop, and opened the video file. The grainy footage showed the interior of Graham's office, the camera perched high in the corner near the ceiling. Marquis could see himself standing in front of Graham's desk, fists clenched in frustration. He remembered every second of that moment, how the tension had boiled over, how Graham had pushed him to his breaking point. "Watch carefully," Michael said, hitting play. The video showed the argument escalating, but Marquis's heart skipped a beat when Graham stood up and threw the first punch, slamming his fist into Marquis's side. It was all there, clear as day. The evidence that Marquis had been attacked first, that he hadn't started the fight. Marquis watched, his eyes glued to the screen, as the footage showed the entire confrontation, including the moment when Marquis fought back and knocked Graham to the floor. When the video ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "There's no way they can deny what happened now. Graham's in the wrong, and you have every right to press charges against him for assault." Marquis exhaled. the tension in his body releasing slightly. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just his word anymore, he had proof. Proof that Graham had not only provoked him, but physically attacked him first. This wasn't just a workplace dispute. This was assault. "What do we do now?" Marquis asked, his voice steady but determined. Michael closed his laptop and looked Marquis in the eye. "We're going to take this to HR and legal, but we're going to do it on our terms. First, we send the footage to their legal department, along with a formal complaint. This forces them to acknowledge what happened and prevents them from spinning the story. Second, we make it clear that if they don't act swiftly, we'll take this public. I'm talking media outlets, social media, the works. A company like Alton Enterprises can't afford the bad press, especially not over something like this." Marquis nodded, feeling the first glimmer of hope. "You think they'll back down?" "They'll have no choice," Michael replied confidently. "We're not just going to defend you, we're going to expose the entire toxic culture they've created. The footage is damning enough, but if they refuse to act, we'll make sure the world knows what kind of workplace they're running." The plan was set. Over the next few hours, Michael drafted the necessary documents, outlining every detail of the discrimination Marquis had faced, from the subtle microaggressions to the outright physical assault. They attached the footage to the email and sent it to the company's legal department. The message was clear. If they didn't act, the world would know. The waiting game began again. Marquis knew that HR and legal couldn't ignore the footage, but he wasn't naive. He knew they'd try to cover their tracks, twist the narrative to protect themselves, but this time they couldn't deny the truth. 2 days later, Marquis received a call from the head of HR, a woman named Ms. Carter. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge of urgency in her voice. "Mr. Johnson, we've reviewed the footage you provided," she began, "and we'd like to discuss a resolution to this situation. Can you come in tomorrow for a meeting?" Marquis exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded approvingly. "I'll be there," Marquis said, keeping his voice steady. The next day, Marquis arrived at the Alton Enterprises office, but this time he wasn't alone. Michael accompanied him, briefcase in hand, his presence a clear signal that Marquis wasn't going to be intimidated. As they walked through the familiar hallways, past the same co-workers who had once snickered and whispered behind his back, Marquis felt a sense of quiet resolve. This was his moment to fight back, and he wasn't going to let them win. They entered the HR office where Ms. Carter sat behind a large oak desk, her expression neutral but serious. Graham was nowhere to be seen, but Marquis could feel his presence lingering in the air. Ms. Carter gestured for them to sit, and the meeting began. "We've reviewed the footage, and it's clear that there was an altercation between you and Mr. Graham," Ms. Carter said, choosing her words carefully. "Given the evidence, we acknowledge that Mr. Graham initiated physical contact, and we are taking disciplinary action against him." Marquis exchanged a quick glance with Michael. This was a start, but it wasn't enough. "Disciplinary action," Michael said, his voice firm. "That's not sufficient. Mr. Graham assaulted my client in his workplace. That's not just a breach of company policy, that's criminal. We're seeking a full investigation into not only this incident but the culture of discrimination Mr. Johnson has endured under Mr. Graham's management." Ms. Carter's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "We take these matters very seriously, Mr. Johnson," she said, addressing Marquis directly. "We're prepared to offer a settlement in exchange for your silence on this matter. It would include a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement." Marquis felt his stomach turn. A settlement? They wanted to pay him off and sweep everything under the rug, but Michael had anticipated this, and he was ready. "We're not interested in a settlement," Michael said, his voice sharp. "We want accountability. Mr. Johnson deserves justice for the harassment and abuse he's suffered, and we're prepared to take this as far as necessary. If you won't address the systemic issues in your company, we will." There was a long pause. Miss Carter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly weighing her options. Marquis could see the gears turning in her mind, calculating the cost of a public scandal versus an internal investigation. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "We will launch a full investigation into the allegations," she said slowly. Mr. Graham will be placed on immediate leave, and we will ensure that the proper steps are taken to address the concerns raised." Marquis exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't everything he had hoped for, but it was a start. Graham would face consequences, and the toxic environment in the company would be brought to light. As he and Michael left the office, Marquis felt a sense of quiet victory. The fight wasn't over, but he had won this battle. He had stood up to a system that had tried to silence him, and now, for the first time, he felt like he had a chance to change things. The weeks following the meeting with HR were tense but filled with progress. Marquis remained away from the office while the company launched its internal investigation into Graham's conduct and the overall work environment. He stayed in close contact with Michael, who worked tirelessly to ensure that Alton Enterprises didn't try to backtrack or sweep anything under the rug. Marquis could feel the weight of years of frustration slowly beginning to lift, but there was still a lingering sense of unfinished business. Despite HR's promises, Marquis couldn't shake the feeling that they were more interested in protecting the company's reputation than delivering true justice. Every day that passed without a solid update felt like another day the company might find a way to wiggle out of responsibility. The fight with Graham had been brutal, both physically and emotionally, but the battle for justice was proving to be just as exhausting. One afternoon, a week after the initial HR meeting, Marquis received an email that made his heart skip a beat. The subject line read, "Alton Enterprises Internal Investigation Findings." He quickly forwarded it to Michael, who called him within minutes. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked, his voice calm but focused. Marquis took a deep breath. "Yeah, let's see what they've got." Michael opened the document on his laptop while Marquis sat on the edge of his couch, gripping his phone tightly. The investigation summary was concise but detailed, outlining the company's findings regarding Graham's conduct and the toxic work environment Marquis had endured for years. "The investigation confirms that Mr. Graham engaged in inappropriate behavior and harassment," Michael read aloud. "It goes on to say that Graham created a hostile work environment not just for you, but for other employees as well. They're terminating him." Marquis closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Terminated. Graham was gone. After all the torment, all the racist insults, all the belittling comments, he was finally gone. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but there was more. "They're offering you a public apology and a financial settlement," Michael continued. "But here's the thing. They want to keep the investigation results private. They don't want this going public." Of course, Marquis thought. The company didn't want the world to know how deep the problem really went. The racism, the bullying, it was all too much for them to admit openly. They'd rather pay Marquis off and pretend it never happened. But for Marquis, this wasn't just about the money. He had wanted justice, not only for himself, but for the countless others who had likely faced similar treatment at Alton Enterprises. He had been fighting not just for his own dignity, but for every person who had been silenced by racism and abuse of power. "I'm not signing any NDA," Marquis said firmly. "They can keep their settlement. I want people to know the truth." Michael nodded, his voice full of pride. "I was hoping you'd say that. We'll tell them the deal's off unless they make the results of the investigation public." The next few days were a whirlwind of negotiations. Alton Enterprises, desperate to avoid a scandal, tried to offer Marquis more money in exchange for his silence, but he refused every time. He didn't want their hush money. He wanted change. Finally, the company relented. They agreed to issue a public statement admitting to the toxic environment Graham had fostered and outlining new policies to prevent such behavior in the future. Graham was not only fired but faced legal consequences for the assault, thanks to the video evidence. The company, under pressure, also pledged to overhaul its diversity and inclusion training, ensuring that no one else would endure what Marquis had. When the public statement was released, it sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Alton Enterprises had long been seen as a successful, prestigious company, but the revelations of racism and harassment painted a very different picture. The media picked up the story, and Marquis's fight for justice became a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic racism. Interviews followed, both for television and online outlets, where Marquis spoke openly about his experiences. He didn't hold back, detailing the discrimination he had faced and the toll it had taken on him. He emphasized the importance of speaking up, of fighting back, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. But despite the public attention, Marquis never lost sight of why he had started this fight in the first place. It wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about accountability and change. One evening, as Marquis sat in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael. "Graham's been charged. He's going to trial." Marquis stared at the message, a sense of closure washing over him. Graham would finally face the consequences of his actions, and for the first time in a long time, Marquis felt like he had won. He had fought back against the system, and while the road had been long and painful, he had emerged stronger. The media eventually moved on to other stories, but Marquis's fight left a lasting impact. Alton Enterprises was forced to reform its practices, and other companies, seeing the fallout, began to take similar steps to address their own internal cultures. The video of the fight between Marcus and Graham became a symbol of resistance, proof that standing up for what's right could spark real change. Months later, Marcus returned to his normal life, but things were different now. He no longer worked for Alton Enterprises. He had no interest in returning to the place that had caused him so much pain. Instead, he had started working with an organization dedicated to fighting workplace discrimination, using his story to help others who had been mistreated. And while the fight for justice was far from over, Marquis knew that he had made a difference. He had stood up, he had spoken out, and he had won. As the story ends, thank you for reading Marquis' journey of resilience and justice. If you found this story powerful, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world to us. Check out our other videos for more inspiring stories of strength, courage, and change.